Welcome back, adventurer. Tonight, the dust is restless, not dramatic. Dust has no need of theatre. It merely knows what comes after the fire has gone out and the mourners have gone home. It knows what settles on ledgers after courts have adjourned. It knows the patient weight of years upon beams, helmets, altars, nursery stools, abandoned watchposts, and the polished lips of wine cups no one has raised in centuries. Ash is sudden. Dust is consequential. Ash shouts. Dust explains. Down here, beneath Waterdeep, and beneath the shallow vanity of those who imagine the present invented appetite, the shelves have been listening again. The leather has drawn tight with age. The old wooden ladders murmur against stone. The candles lean in their brass throats and make honest work of the dark, which is all one may reasonably ask of a candle. Above us, the city continues its busy little genius for forgetting. Bargains are struck. Oaths are diluted. Tower windows glow with people certain they are living in the important age. Somewhere, a merchant calls a map definitive. Somewhere, a magistrate mistakes paperwork for permanence. Somewhere, a young scholar, eager as untempered steel, says the phrase, "after the war," as though the words themselves were a door one could pass through and latch behind. You know better now. Or you are learning. You have returned to the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Belnorn, Law Warden, curator of long embarrassments, and one of the last respectable enemies of the phrase, "and then things improved." I keep memory where the damp cannot get it, and where triumphalists must descend steps to lie. It is useful work. Civilization is forever manufacturing euphemism, and someone must keep the older nouns within reach. Last time, we followed the Fifth Crown War to its exhausted conclusion. We watched Elven Court grow from divine summons into a centuries-long tribunal, and then into a moral center for those surface elves who remained. We watched House Vishan finally named, judged, resisted, and broken. We looked west toward Evermeet and found not merely a paradise, but a diagnosis. A refuge beautiful enough to reveal how badly the mainland had ceased to feel trustworthy. We traced how Arivandar collapsed, how its old heartland could not simply be reoccupied, and how the surviving elves answered victory not with restored confidence, but with dispersal, caution, councils, sanctuaries, and tested heirlooms. I told you then that the last Crown War ended the Empire and did not restore the world. Tonight, we begin to prove what that failure made possible. This episode is about the founding time, that long stretch from -9,000 to -3,000 Daily Reckoning, when the realms stop being an almost exclusively elven argument and become something more crowded, more opportunistic, more subterranean, more human, and in several ways more dangerous. But I do not want you to hear founding time and imagine a row of clean first stones laid by clean hands under a benevolent sky. Founding is one of history's more flattering verbs. What is founded after catastrophe is rarely innocent. It is usually an answer, and answers are shaped by the wounds that demanded them. So that is our question tonight. Who inherits ruins? Not who deserves them. History has almost no interest in deserving, not who loved them most. Ruins are notoriously indifferent to affection. Who inherits them? Who can feed a child beside them? who can turn a broken road into a trade route, a desecrated temple into a warning, a collapsed cavern into a capital, a haunted wood into a border, a hidden valley into a policy, a forgotten watchtower into a doctrine, an old grievance into a state. Because when the Crown Wars ended, Faerûn did not receive peace. It received vacancy. And vacancy is never vacant for long. The elves, wounded but still mighty, rebuilt in forests, fastnesses, holy courts, hidden vales, and distant islands. The dwarves reclaimed ancestral depths, raised new delvings, and learned once more the severe arithmetic of survival under stone. The drow, duergar, mind flayers, and older things of the deep discovered that a surface civilization, busy judging itself, often leaves the underways insufficiently watched. Human tribes and villages, lacking the burden of millennial shame and blessed with the unnerving speed of the short-lived, crept into the spaces between elder certainties and began, quietly at first, to become powers in their own right. That is the true shape of the era, not recovery, succession, not a healed world, a contested inheritance. We will walk the eastern forests where Elven Court ceases to be only a tribunal and becomes the seedbed of new polities. We will slip into the hidden valley of Evereska and ask what it means when secrecy becomes civic virtue. We will move north into the old reaches of Arivandar and watch Silvanede, Sharvan, and Eirlan refight in gentler clothes and then in bloodier ones, questions the Crown Wars should have taught them to fear. We will go below and listen as the Underdark stops being merely a place of exile and becomes a political world of its own. Telantiwar, the Great Rift, Lurthdryer, Shamath, Menzoberranzan, Chednasad, and all the grim, efficient mathematics by which hunger becomes empire in the dark. And before we close the folio, we will lift our gaze to the younger peoples rising at the margins. Imaskar in the east, Corumshan, and later Kalimshan in the south. Charmdath by the Vilhon, the first alliance that will become Netheril in the north. And ask why ruins so often teach their best lessons to those who did not build them. This one is less accusatory than the last episode, and no less tragic. Last time the elves judged themselves. Tonight the world begins judging what remains of them by how much space they have left behind. Before we descend into the age of settlers, scavengers, priests, refugees, tunnel lords, and practical opportunists, a brief word from the wise folk who continue to support an undead archival project in an era that prefers its history short, affirming, and preferably attached to a purchase. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, builders of elegant websites, reliable digital systems, and the sort of structural coherence that empires forever promise and very seldom deliver. If you need front-end work that does not confuse ornament for thought, back-end architecture that will still function after the first avoidable panic, or a team capable of joining the two without melodrama, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They build the way old fortress engineers carved drainage, with the modest hope that weather will exist and the grim certainty that someone else will one day depend on the result. Now then, bring the candle closer. We are entering the age when the dead stopped ruling by proclamation and started ruling by vacancy. The first thing to understand about ruins is that they are not empty. You may look upon a shattered gate, a poisoned moor, a road whose milestones have been worn smooth by 1,000 seasons of rain, and think absence. That is because you are living. The living are vain about vacancy. They notice who is no longer at table and forget how much the table itself still teaches. A ruined place continues to direct movement. It tells armies where supply once flowed. It tells refugees where wells might still lie beneath briar. It tells traders which valley can be crossed without losing half a caravan to weather. It tells priests where sanctity has been wounded and therefore where penance must be made conspicuous. It tells monsters where the old cellars are. It tells the ambitious where stone was once worth cutting and therefore where more stone may be hidden below. Magic worsens this or improves it according to temperament. In Faerûn, a ruin is seldom merely masonry. It may be an old oath still clinging to land. It may be a ward half failed and therefore far more treacherous than if it had died cleanly. It may be a place where the weave has been bruised, stretched, sweetened, or made thin. It may remember a god's attention. It may have a name that still opens doors 300 miles away. The Crown Wars left all of these behind. Burned forests do not merely become forests again. Choked caverns do not merely become geology. They become invitations written in the grammar of loss. The founding time begins, therefore, not with peace treaties, but with movement. Some movements are pious, pilgrimages to Elven Court, quiet westward voyages to Evermeet, processions of clan relics under moonlight into hidden valleys no map should reveal. Some movements are practical. Dwarven caravans shifting from one delving to another. Human fishers edging farther up a river because no one now patrols the opposite bank with elder certainty. Drow nobles lead in slaves through lightless tunnels toward caverns large enough to stage their next claim. Some movements are ugly. Raiders testing emptied watch lines, cults searching the undersides of broken shrines for leftover power, spell-haunted beasts breeding in territories that no longer hear the disciplined footfall of wardens. This is why the age deserves its own episode. The founding time is when consequences learned to walk. For the elves above ground, the first answer was not empire, but rerouting. We have already spoken of Elven Court, as wound, as holy compromise. Now we must speak of what gathered around it. In the eastern forests that later ages would know as Arkarah, and later still as the greater forest of Cormanthor, Elven Court became the first permanent settlement under the trees after the Crown Wars. This matters more than it first appears. The first enduring answer to civilizational catastrophe was not a restored throne, not a reconsecrated capital in the old imperial center, not a grand reoccupation of Arivandar's dead heart. It was a place of judgment, becoming a place of dwelling. What sort of people build their first post-war home around a tribunal? Elves, obviously. But ask the deeper question. What kind of life follows from that choice? A more careful one, a more moralized one, a more watched one. In the generations after the Fifth Crown War, many of those born and raised at Elven Court returned to the Great Eastern Wood and founded the first settlements of Arkarah, Semberholm, Uveren, Rystal Wood, and Jirenstar. Do not think of these as little pioneer hamlets. They were realms, or at least the seeds of realms, each carrying a different answer to the shared question of how an elf ought to live after elfkind had spent 3,000 years proving itself unfit for easy confidence. Ristal wood, more sylvan and less interested in permanence, bore the old green elven suspicion that too much masonry is only vanity waiting to harden. The folk there preferred distance, movement, and the sort of woodland intimacy that leaves fewer temptations to call oneself central. One reason later ages forget such realms is that they do not flatter historians. A people that leaves fewer monuments leaves fewer chances for a chronicler to stand before a ruin and feel significant. Yet these are often the wisest post-war societies. They build lightly because they have learned what the heavy things attract. Uverin, by contrast, grew learned. Its settlements and librariums made it one of the great memory places of the early age. This too is telling. After a war fought in no small part by the manipulation of history, claim, lineage, and sanctified grievance, one branch of the elves answered by gathering books, songs, spell lore, and the long, patient apparatus of preservation. I approve. I am perhaps biased, but the point is broader than my professional vanity. Uvaerin represents a civilizational choice. If magnificence has become dangerous, then let memory itself become the treasure. Better shelves than banners, better librariums than coronation roads, better a scholar's pilgrimage than a conqueror's parade. Semberholm and Gyrenstar turned more directly toward protection. They were places of guardianship, of watchfulness, of making the forest itself part of the answer. Gyrenstar, in particular, stood near the heart of the great wood and sought to preserve both people and trees from any renewal of Crown War chaos. Its magics shaped growth itself, raising forests to greater height and density, as if architecture made of living wood might prove less vulnerable to the old diseases than courts of stone and gold. There is a poignant intelligence in that. If cities had failed, perhaps the forest, tutored and exalted but not wholly subdued, might carry the burden more honestly. Together, these realms formed not an empire, but a moral geography. Elven Court, at their center, remained neutral ground, holy ground, and a place where weapons were not to be drawn. The Four Realms deferred to its elders not because they had re-established a crowned supremacy over the East, but because the court's judgments retained a prestige no ordinary line could yet claim. This is a quieter kind of authority than Arivandar knew. It does not trumpet conquest. It chastens, it mediates, it remembers. It is also, I think, a little frightened of itself. Again, no mockery is intended. Frightened institutions can be wise if they know what they fear. The post-war elves feared repetition. They feared the return of dynastic appetite dressed in refinement. They feared the seductive simplicity of "this house is fit to rule because it always has." They feared that beauty without restraint might once again learn to call itself destiny. So they built realms that were beautiful, yes, but tethered to a central memory of judgment. Even their daily life changed. Imagine what it means to be a child born in Gyrenstar instead of in pre-war Arivandar. Your elders still sing. Your priests still pray to the Seldarine. The forest is still moon-washed and articulate. But you do not grow up under an assumption of effortless primacy. You grow up hearing that the trees must be watched, the borders tended, the the lineages examined, the past recalled correctly, the old roads used carefully, the drow below never wholly forgotten. You learn peace not as ambient confidence, but as practiced discipline. You are taught that the forest can be a home, yes, but also that it can become a front if the people grow arrogant again. This is rebuilding, but it is rebuilding under moral supervision. The early relationship between Elven Court and the dwarves of Saarfell shows how much the age had already widened beyond purely elven repair. At first, the court sought to keep the eastern forests under its control and fought the dwarves to prevent surface expansion. Sensible enough. Post-war peoples are never instantly cosmopolitan. They are too busy counting the dead and deciding which borders still deserve the name. Yet after a time, Saarfell and Elven Court struck an alliance, and both prospered through trade and exchange of information. This is easy to overlook, and one should not. One of the first durable post-war arrangements in the East was not elven self-enclosure, but negotiated coexistence between elves and dwarves. That matters for two reasons. First, it reminds us that the founding time is not only the story of elder peoples retreating from one another, it is also the story of selective and often very productive interdependence. The dwarves wanted trade, access, and security. The elves wanted buffers, information, and stability along the Dragon Reach. Both had reasons to suspect, reasons to bargain, reasons to limit the other, and reasons finally to profit by peace. These are the arrangements from which actual history is made, not the cleaner fables of pure withdrawal or universal harmony. Second, it teaches the episode's main lesson in miniature. The ruins of the old Elven Age were not inherited by elves alone. From the earlier stages of the founding time, the future belonged to negotiated edges. Dwarves, elves, and soon enough humans would all find ways to live beside the wreckage, not merely after it. Yet even in these careful eastern woods, catastrophe returned. It always does. The question is only how long your generation imagines itself exempt. Before we move farther west and north, let us linger a little with the ordinary life these new arrangements produced. The founding time is too often narrated as though peoples spend 6,000 years doing nothing but founding realms, naming rulers, and engaging in highly decorative strategic movement. Tiresome nonsense. Most of history is lived in kitchens, shrines, workshops, tunnel mouths, ferry landings, fungus beds, nursery groves, and the cold little pause before dawn when a sentry decides whether the sound in the leaves deserves a horn. After the Crown Wars, ordinary elven life changed in ways both subtle and immense. Travel grew more purposeful. In the old great ages, an elf might move among broad-related realms under assumptions of shared prestige, shared language registers, shared temple hospitality, and a general certainty that the world, though contested, remained recognizably elven in much of its important terrain. During the founding time, movement more often meant passage between enclaves of distinct temperament. From Elven Court to Uvaeren was not simply a journey between two pleasant woods, it was movement between different constitutional moods. From Evereska to the outer hills was not a casual ramble. It was a matter of secrecy, route discipline, and the management of absence. To leave home increasingly meant to cross not only physical borders, but philosophies of survival. Marriage shifted with this as well. lineage remained important, of course. The Telquesir do not stop noticing ancestry any more than dragons stop noticing who is touching the coin pile. But after Arivandar and the descent, lineage alone had become morally compromised as an unquestioned title to trust. Houses watched one another more carefully. Priests and elders judged not simply pedigree, but what kind of memory a household carried, what alliances it had survived, what gods its grief had turned it toward, what ambitions still scented the talk around its feasts. The Moonblades answered this problem ritually among certain noble lines. Ordinary families answered it more quietly, through caution, questions, and the long, slow testing of character that elves can afford, because time is one of the few things they seldom lack. Religion changed in register even where doctrine remained familiar. The Seldarin were still honored, shrines still kept the calendars, seasonal rites still marked planting, mourning, naming, and return. Yet piety after the Crown Wars was less innocent than before. Every temple stood in the shadow of divine intervention that had not been morally comfortable. Priests could no longer speak as though the gods were merely patrons of beauty, craft, and proper order. They had been participants in history at terrifying scale. That does not end devotion, it complicates it. Worship gains gravity. Ritual gains an undertone of caution. Sacred places become not only communal centers, but hedges against a world known now to be much harder to govern than the hymns alone admit. Even craft changed. A jeweler in pre-war Arivandar might have labored chiefly for elegance, lineage display, ceremonial use, or the ordinary, beautiful vanity that civilized peoples rightly cherish. A jeweler in the founding times still makes beauty, yes, but increasingly beauty with secondary purpose. Clasps conceal tokens of passage. Ornament encodes kinship and safe conduct. Light law preserves clan history in forms not legible to outsiders. Architectural carving doubles as warning or archive. A thing made lovely is also asked to carry memory, proof, or warding, because no one trusts mere appearance to keep a people safe any longer. Children notice such things before adults believe they do. A child born into the founding time learns silence earlier, not muteness. Elves are not a taciturn people by nature, whatever dour human soldiers claim after being politely corrected on grammar by moon elves for 6 straight weeks. But silence of a certain kind, when not to ask a traveller his house before the meal, when not to say the old name of a ruined land in mixed company, when not to inquire too eagerly why Aunt Melrian flinches at certain songs from the south, when not to mention to strangers which paths toward the valley are real and which are lures. This is culture after catastrophe. The young inherit not just stories, but calibrations. So do the dwarves. A child in a refounded delving or in a caravan running between old underways learns the practical liturgy of survival. How to listen to stone, how to read air, how to tell an ancestral road from an ambitious death trap patched by fools. Which old grudges are ceremonial and which are active engineering constraints. Dwarven children, unlike elven ones, are less likely to be burdened with elegant euphemism. This is to their credit. Yet they inherit other weights: expectation, oath, continuity, the sense that to rebuild is not optional but obligatory, and that failure to hold what ancestors held is not simply misfortune, but a kind of shame one must answer in work. Human children in the same age inherit something still different. They grow up amidst remains they did not make, and stories they only partly believe. To them, a fallen elf tower may be haunted, glorious, dangerous, profitable, or all four before breakfast. A shattered dwarven outpost might be a cautionary tale to their elders and a promising store of dressed stone to their generation. Their relationship to the past is therefore more improvisational. They do not bear the same grief for ruins because the ruins are not theirs. This frees them. It also makes them bolder in ways the elder races often mistake for disrespect, when it is more properly called detachment. And below, in the Underdark, ordinary life becomes harsher than most surface poets can imagine without becoming melodramatic. Food is political, water is political, air is political. Darkness is not an atmosphere, but a property one buys with security and loses with incompetence. Children there learn roots before songs, poisons before festivals, the symbols of powerful houses before the names of strangers. They also learn splendor, mind you. Never believe the deep incapable of magnificence. Drow cities are often breathtaking in exactly the way a jeweled blade is breathtaking. Durgar halls can be formidable in their severe precision. Even the mushroom gardens, cistern chambers, and market galleries of lesser settlements possess their own dark economies of beauty. But every beauty below is shadowed by necessity more nakedly than on the surface. The founding time, then, is not only when realms were founded. It is when daily life across Faerûn learned new habits of caution, concealment, reclamation, and use. You cannot understand the later realms if you imagine those habits remained local. They became the atmosphere. Ages passed, the court endured. Akara thickened into a lived forest rather than a merely symbolic one, and elsewhere another answer to post-war existence took shape. Evereska. I have always admired the honesty of hidden valleys. They are among the least boastful political forms. An island can still pose. An island can say, "Behold how holy the sea has made me." A mountain realm can say, "Behold how stern I am, how difficult to approach, how admirable my endurance." A hidden valley says something simpler and usually sadder. We do not trust the world enough to be visible to it. Around -8,600 reckoning, surviving clans from broken Western Elven realms quietly founded the haven of Evereska east of old Arivandar. Note the timing. This is not the immediate first lunge of panic after the Fifth Crown War, but the more deliberate recognition centuries later that concealment itself may need to become policy. That delay matters. It tells us Evereska was not merely a camp of fugitives, it was a reasoned answer. A concealed refuge known only to the Telquesir. A place built not to dominate a region, but to preserve a people. Preservation changes architecture. You do not build a secret haven as you build a capital. Processional roads become hidden paths. Towers are for sight and warning, not display. Rituals favor warding as much as pageantry. Records must be accurate and portable. Tombs must be secure. The young must learn not simply who they are, but when not to reveal it. Even joy becomes quieter in such places, not lesser, quieter. It is difficult to grow ostentatious when concealment is one of your founding principles. Evereska therefore represents a vital shift in Elven statecraft. Elves had hidden before, of course, Ambush, glamour, and selective revelation are older than some gods' present mask choices. But a hidden kingdom, built as a long-term sanctuary, is something else. It is a society that has concluded visibility itself can be a political liability. That is no small admission for an elder people. There is dignity in it, yes. A people nearly destroyed by its own overreach and by the consequences of its old prominence might wisely choose a smaller, safer form. Yet let us not romanticize too quickly. Secrecy has costs. It narrows commerce. It limits the ordinary traffic by which mixed societies learn each other. It can intensify inwardness, pride, and the temptation to curate not merely one's borders, but one's memory. A hidden valley keeps enemies out. It also keeps embarrassment in. Still, Everesca survived. And survival is an argument difficult to sneer at from the outside. We can see its influence in what happened next. By minus 7,600, overcrowding in the Western refugees and disgust with more overbearing Sun-Elven aristocratic habits helped spur new migration northward into the high forest. There, the realm of Faerûn was founded by moon elves from Everesca and other migrants who preferred a more mixed and tolerant order. Against it, or beside it, depending on which map and which grievance you are reading, stood Silvanede, an exclusively Sun-Elven realm founded some centuries earlier in the old Arivandari north. Now here, the founding time becomes especially instructive, for it proves that rebuilding does not erase ideology. It redistributes it. Silvanede is one of those realms later elves sometimes speak of too softly. One hears much about its beauty, its silver spires, its mythal-cloaked cities, its refinement, its high Sun-Elven culture. All of this is true enough. But one must add what the polite songs omit. Silvanede was, in many respects, Arivandar's pride, distilled rather than cured. Several hundred years after the fall of that old imperial power, Sun Elves returned to the high forest and founded a realm that soon desired to reclaim the exalted heights once achieved by Arivandar. There. That is the diagnosis. The lesson of the Crown Wars had not penetrated equally into all hearts. Some survivors looked upon catastrophe and concluded that greatness must henceforth be hidden, tested, chastened, or shared. Others looked upon the same catastrophe and concluded, more quietly and therefore more dangerously, that the trouble had been not supremacy itself, but the wrong people wielding it poorly. This is among the oldest mistakes in politics. The tyrant falls, and the refined cousin decides the real lesson is that tyranny requires better manners. Silvanede offered those manners in abundance. Its great city, Adofairanede, later known as Myth Adofair, after the raising of its mythal, glittered with exactly the sort of defensive beauty that tempts a people to mistake aesthetic discipline for moral safety. You will notice I return to this theme often. I do so because history keeps rewarding it. The more elegant a culture's self-presentation, the easier it becomes for that culture to imagine vice must look coarser than itself. Silvanede is a study in that era. It was splendid, it was clever, it was culturally elevated, and it carried within itself a stubborn conviction that Sun-Elven distinction remained a kind of cosmic evidence. Faerûn, by contrast, embodied a different answer. Mixed, more tolerant, fed by migration from Everesca and by descent within Silvanede itself, It suggested that the future of elven survival might require broader composition, humbler politics, and a more suspicious view of Sun-Elven exclusivity. Do not mistake this for modern egalitarianism. Sharvan was still an elven realm, still hierarchical in many ways, still proud, still quite capable of drawing lines between elf and not elf. But compared with Silvanede, it represented a real divergence. One can hear in its founding a refusal to let the High Forest become Arivandar by another name. This is the kind of quarrel that decides ages. Not merely who holds what hill. Which lesson from the last disaster is allowed to become custom? The tension sharpened over centuries. Around -4700, nobles from Sharvan founded Eorlan in the remnants of Arivandar, specifically to counter the ambitions of Silvanede by claiming the old northern ruins before Silvaneden power could do so. Observe the precision of this move. Eorlan was not founded because the forest there was merely lovely, though no doubt it was. It was founded because ruins create strategic questions. If the remnants of Arivandar were left unattended, who would claim them? With what banners? With what rhetoric of restoration? Eorlan answered by stepping into the old scar and saying, in effect, no, not again, not by you. Who inherits ruins? Sometimes the answer is whoever arrives first with the clearest fear. Eorlan's founders understood that abandoned grandeur is politically magnetic. Leave an old imperial cradle untended, and eventually someone will call their occupation of it a rebirth, so they built a counterweight. This is one of the founding time's most important statecraft lessons, and one humans learn very quickly later on. If you do not wish a ruin to become someone else's legitimacy, you must either sanctify it, garrison it, or settle it yourself. Yet fear of repetition is not the same thing as immunity to repetition. Silvanede darkened from within. House Dlar Drageth, a proud sun-elven line with roots in earlier Akara, turned toward demonkind in an effort to strengthen its blood and seize the power necessary to rebuild Arivandar's grandeur. I want that sentence to sit, because it is the entire age in miniature. Even after the Crown Wars, even after the Descent, even after Elven Court, even after dispersal and refuge and all the weary sermons of history, there remained elves who looked upon the wreckage and said, perhaps with fiend blood. One admires unwillingly the terrible purity of the mistake. They courted Tanari, bred what later ages would know as the Faerie or Demon Fae, and secreted away a project of restoration by corruption. Not restoration of peace, understand, restoration of Arivandar. The old dream had not died, it had become infernal. And because the realms has a vulgar sense of irony, it did so under the custody of people elegant enough to believe themselves misunderstood. When Eorlan's and Akara's high mages finally moved against the Dlar Drageth plots around -4500, the result was the beginning of the Seven Citadels War, sometimes bitterly called the Sixth Crown War. I would not press that label too far, but I understand why it survived. The point was not that the war matched the ancient crown conflicts in scale. It did not. The point was that the old disease had clearly not vanished. In the High Forest, far from the earliest bloodletting among descendants who should have known better, supremacy, secrecy, and fiendish leverage had again combined. How small the distance is between never again and, perhaps this time, more carefully. The Seven Citadels War dragged across generations. Silvaniden veterans, more experienced and more richly equipped, skirmished with the newer but determined forces of Erlen and its allies. House Dladrageth and the Daemonfae turned the contest nastier, less stable, more spiritually rotten. In the end, Erlen prevailed. Silvanide was broken, its untainted elves were spared. Myth Adofair, the realm's great mythal-shrouded city, was placed in magical stasis rather than destroyed outright. That final choice is worth pausing over. The victors did not simply annihilate Silvanide, they sealed its brilliance away. This is another post-Crown War pattern. When the elves fear what a beautiful place has become, they do not always raise it. Sometimes they put it to sleep. Sleep, stasis, warding, abandonment, holy quarantine. These are the favored elven answers to morally compromised magnificence. The impulse is both merciful and evasive. Merciful because it refuses crude obliteration. Evasive because it postpones the fullest reckoning. What cannot be reintegrated is preserved at a distance. Again, sanctuary, secrecy, exception. The old habit returns, and the old lesson with it. The founding time was not a simple climb out of ruin. It was a centuries-long process by which the survivors kept discovering that ruin had followed them into the forms of rebuilding they preferred most. The Green Elves understood this differently. It is common, especially among Gold Elf chroniclers and humans who confuse court records with reality, to tell the history of post-war elfdom chiefly through its better-known realms. Evermeet, Evereska, Elvencourt, Silvanide, Sharvan, Eorlan, later Cormanther. Very impressive, very architecturally cooperative. Yet a great many elves responded to the founding time not by refining statecraft, but by distrusting it more thoroughly. This is where the divergence of the Green Elves into what later ages would more sharply distinguish as Wood Elves and Wild Elves becomes important. Do not imagine that these identities emerged in some idyllic natural drift, as though a few forest-dwelling cousins simply preferred different hunting songs and the matter sorted itself out under moonlight. Culture does not split so dramatically without pressure. The Crown Wars and their long aftermath were among that pressure. Many Green Elves had watched the grander polities of the Telquesir transform civilization into a machine for burning forests in more literate language. They had seen beauty militarized, bloodline moralized, and ritual power bent into sentence and counter-sentence. Some had endured direct loss of land and people. Others had survived by distance and learned to regard distance itself as wisdom. During the founding time, they settled more deeply into woodlands and wildernesses that would define them. By the time later human empires begin to notice them in earnest, these peoples are already living by a different argument than their urban or courtly kin. The Wood Elf answer is still civilizational, but smaller in scale and closer to the grain of the forest. Clan matters, territory matters, custom matters. One may trade, ally, speak with neighbors, even enter into wider wars. But the unit of belonging is no longer the vast continental dream of elven supremacy. It is the woodland, the vale, the local sacred, the hunting range, the warded glade. This is not provincialism in the stupid sense. It is strategic intimacy. A people who no longer trust empires learn to prize what can be known well enough to defend without becoming monstrous. The Wild Elf answer goes further. Their civilization itself begins to look suspect in excess. Monumentality, elaborate hierarchy, heavy traffic with outsiders, accumulation for its own sake, these start to resemble the first perfumes of a later fire. Better movement than rooted vanity. Better clan memory than central archive. Better to live with the forest than to make of the forest a capital one might someday be tempted to call eternal. You may hear in this a criticism of cities from a Balnorn who happens to inhabit a very old subterranean archive beneath one of the most crowded cities on the Sword Coast. Correct. I am capable of hypocrisy only in moderation. Yet the green elven critique must be respected. It emerged from evidence. The great realms had indeed failed catastrophically. The hidden valleys and holy courts, admirable though they were, still represented forms of concentrated value. Concentrated value attracts siege, corruption, envy, and sometimes one's own most decorative lunatics. A people that chooses instead to remain difficult to centralize is not primitive. It is making a constitutional wager of its own. This matters to the larger history because it further fragments the elven inheritance of the old world. By the middle of the founding time, there is no single agreed answer to the question, what should an elf realm be now? There are temple centers like Elven Court, hidden refuges like Evereska, island sanctuaries like Evermeet, exclusivist high elven experiments like Silvanede, mixed northern counterweights like Sharvan and Airlan, deep woodland cultures that increasingly prefer smaller scales of belonging, southern forest realms that will later face human expansion with their own long memories and their own less courtly senses of justice. This diversity is real. It is also diagnostic. It means the people did not merely rebuild. They lost consensus about how rebuilding ought to look. That loss of consensus is part of what other races inherit. Humans, for example, benefit enormously from the fact that the elves no longer present one obvious civilizational front. An isolated vale may be formidable. A mythal-cloaked city may be daunting. But a world in which elves are divided among islands, hidden valleys, central forests, wild woodland cultures, and mutually suspicious high-born enclaves is a world far easier for fast-growing younger peoples to edge into. Dwarves, too, navigate this more fractured landscape with skill, bargaining with one elven realm here, crossing land once watched by another there, profiting from the spaces between old certainties. So even the most inward elven choices, however understandable, reshape the whole of Faerûn. This is why one must resist the sentimental version of retreat. Retreat is never merely retreat. It is also an invitation, whether deliberate or not, for someone else to inherit the road you no longer patrol. The southern and eastern forests offer further evidence. Some green elven realms, such as Nikarimath and others of the eastern woods, retained broader territorial identities for long stretches. Others thinned, drifted, or localized. Yorwood, for example, becomes less a node in some continent-wide elven political network, and more itself, a sacred and haunted eastern forest with its own people, its own bargains, its own later entanglements. This pattern repeats across Faerûn. The old elder web frays into a constellation. Beautiful points of light, yes, but constellations are not roads. And the younger races, especially humans, are very good at mistaking the gaps between stars for permission. Keep that thought near. We shall need it when the human empires begin to rise in earnest. For now, we must go below, because the surface spent a long while imagining the deep as a consequence. The founding time teaches us that it had already become a competitor. Above-ground peoples often speak of the Underdark as though it were one place. This is surface arrogance. The deep is not one place any more than sea is one harbour. It is vault, abyss, fungal plain, drowned gallery, magma throat, slave road, dead city, fissure, bridge of natural stone, poisoned spring, ancient prison, and hungry darkness in ratios that vary by every 100 miles and sometimes by every 3. To say the Underdark usefully is a little like saying weather while marching into a hurricane with a sun hat and a diagram. The founding time is the age in which the peoples of Faerûn, especially above ground, should have learned this more thoroughly than they did. For in these millennia, the deep stops being merely the destination of punishment and becomes a world producing its own powers, alliances, migrations, economies, and strategic shocks. Exile, once organized, is no longer simply suffering. It becomes politics. Begin with the great wound beneath the Shah. When the Dark Elves first fled, or were driven into the Underdark in the aftermath of the descent, one of their most consequential acts was the conquest of Perindon, the ancestral cavern home of the dwarves. This enormous region, later called Great Perindon, had already been old when the Drow entered it. The dwarves had shaped cities there, dug roots there, and made of stone a homeland on a scale surface historians seldom appreciate because sunlight flatters superficial maps. The Drow seized that inheritance and renamed their dominion Telantiwar. There it is again. Who inherits ruins? The answer first was not the rightful builders. It was the newly exiled, newly desperate Dark Elves, still close enough to their surface catastrophe to burn with both shame and fury, and skilled enough in magic and organization to turn that fury into conquest. The dwarves of Perindon were scattered. The Drow took the cities. Notice the pattern. Surface elves had attempted to solve one civilizational problem by expelling a category downward. The result was not disappearance, but the creation of a new conquering power in the greatest available subterranean infrastructure. This is why I distrust easy sentences. The deep rewarded competence, cruelty, and adaptability. The Drow possessed all three in ugly abundance. Yet the Underdark did not simplify them, it diversified them. That is one of the first great corrective truths of Drow history. Too many surface accounts act as if the Drow emerge below already fully formed in the image later surface nightmares prefer. All Lolth, all priestess, all spider, all treachery in one identical pattern. No. The early Drow inherit too much and lose too much to remain so simple. They arrive carrying old house rivalries, mixed devotions, conflicting memories of surface life, and vastly different ideas of what survival below should require. The Underdark then pressures these differences, sharpens them, and makes them infrastructural. Why infrastructural? Because underground politics are built on scarcity. On the surface, a kingdom can lose a road and still find another valley. It can plant elsewhere. It can spread. Below, A road may be a tunnel only 20 feet wide, with a chasm on one side and mind flayer territory 3 days beyond it. Water matters more, fungus fields matter more, ventilation matters more, access shafts matter more. A cavern large enough to support a city is not merely desirable, it is destiny-wearing stalactites. Every major decision is therefore more physical, more immediate, and often more tyrannical. The ruler who controls the cistern, the gate to the mushroom terraces, the route to the slave markets, or the warded bridge over the Black Gulf controls life in a way surface princes only fantasize about. This shaped Drow society profoundly. Matron houses, priestly hierarchies, and rigid social cruelty were not born solely from theology, though Lolth delighted in all of them. They were also reinforced by environment. In a world where supply is fragile and visibility short, domination becomes intimate. You do not merely tax a district. You decide whether the tunnel doors open. You do not simply announce a doctrine. You control which caravans reach the water caverns before the Gricks do. The Drow learned quickly. So did the stone. Talantiwar did not last. Less than 2 millennia after the Drow conquest of Peirinden, around -7600, the Great Cavern collapsed. The domed ceilings of its enormous vaults came crashing down after long civil strife and great magical explosions among the Drow. The reasons remain disputed. Some surface scholars blame over-reliance on magic to shore up a realm never meant to bear such strain. Many Gold Dwarves hold, with unsurprising satisfaction, that Moradin himself struck the cavern as one might split rotten timber. The Drow, if they recorded their own culpability honestly, were not courteous enough to preserve such documents where later historians could easily admire them. The result, however, is clear. Talantiwar was shattered. The open wound, later known as the Great Rift, was born. Many Drow were crushed. Great portions of their conquered dwarven cities were destroyed. The survivors gathered what nobles, slaves, stores, and portable gods they could and fled into neighboring caverns. And once again, the question opened. Who inherits ruins now? The answer changed immediately. Before long, dwarves returned to their ancestral region and established the Deep Realm in and around the Great Rift, becoming the ancestors of the Gold Dwarves of later Faerûn. That return deserves more awe than it usually receives. Imagine it. You come back not to a preserved homeland, but to a broken colossal cavity split open to the sky, filled with the wreckage of your people's older work and your conqueror's more recent one. The place has changed form. The memory of defeat is still in the stone. The Drow are not gone, merely dispersed into adjacent depths, and you decide, here. We begin again here. Dwarves, as you will hear at painful but deserved length next episode, possess an extraordinary ability to treat grief as a building material. The Drow dispersion after Talantiwar matters just as much. One stream of survivors helped found or swell later powers in Great Peirinden, including the ooze-shadowed Luth Dryer and the southern holdings such as Golothair, from which later migrations would proceed. Another consequence was more general and more important. The collapse triggered a hectic scramble across the Underdark to claim new territory. This is the birth of the Deep as a multipolar political field. No single Drow conquest absorbs everything. No single exile story dominates. Instead, There are competing cities, cults, tunnels, trade paths, grudges, and local hegemonies. In other words, history. Lurthdryer deserves particular attention because it exposes Drow religion as political substance rather than mere ornament. Between -5112 and -4835, the Webfire War racked that city and its sphere as the followers of Gaunador clashed with the worshippers of Lolth. One may be tempted to treat this as intra-Drow sectarianism of interest mainly to priests and very unlucky civilians. Resist that temptation. In the Underdark, theology is logistics. A city devoted to the Elder Eye, or to that which lurks, will organize space, fear, sacrifice, and authority differently from one devoted to the Spider Queen. The fight between Ooze cult and Web cult was therefore also a fight about what kind of Drow future would dominate the deep. This is another point surface histories habitually flatten. The Drow were never one thing. Lolth sought that monopoly. She did not always enjoy it. Gaunador's cults promised power of a different, more dissolving kind. Faerûn lurked where masculine ambition and surface-raiding cleverness gathered. Eilistraee, though far less institutionally dominant in many great cities, remained a surviving contradiction to the whole easy story of inevitable descent. Her faithful proved that memory could persist downward without consenting entirely to what the deep demanded. That mattered then, and matters still. Lurthdryer's wars also show how quickly the Drow learned to turn ideology into urban warfare. No surface audience should flatter itself that only humans invent civil conflict with administrative complexity. The Drow were building that art under the earth, while many surface elves were still congratulating themselves for having named House Vishan and moved on. Around -4973, House Shamath founded the city of Shamath beneath the Western Heartlands. At first, it was a more standard Lolthite Drow city. Later ages would know it for a different character, more mercantile and more dominated by arcane power than the priestess-led orthodoxy of places like Menzoberranzan. That full transformation lies beyond our present era, but the founding itself already matters. It proves the northward and westward spread of Drow power was well underway. The deep was not merely digesting southern exile. It was extending its reach into regions surface folk would later foolishly assume had always belonged to their own histories. And this, my apprentice, is where the founding time begins to darken again in the east. You remember the alliance between Elven Court and Sarfil. You remember the hopeful modesty of that arrangement, the exchange of trade and information, the notion that post-war survival might perhaps produce better neighbors than pre-war vanity. Good. Hold it, because history is about to insult it. On midwinter night of -4400, during a feast celebrating 2 millennia of peace between Arkarar and Sarfil, a combined force of Drow and Duergar erupted from previously unnoticed tunnels and fell upon Elven Court. The Dark Court slaughter began. I will say that name only once more tonight, and even that may be too often. It is one of the great violations of the era because it was aimed not merely at military capacity, but at the symbolic heart of the post-war order. Elven Court was holy ground. Weapons were not drawn there. It was where the survivors had chosen to make judgment itself architectural. Saarfill's dwarves were not merely allies present by accident. They were partners in one of the founding time's most honorable experiments in coexistence. To strike there at that feast on that night was to declare that the Underdark had been watching and had chosen its target with exquisite contempt. Some traditions place Wendonai's hand behind this assault, still tutoring, still corrupting, still unwilling to surrender the drow fully to any fate not sharpened by his own appetite. Whether one emphasizes the fiend or not, the larger truth remains. By minus 4400, the drow and duergar had matured enough as powers to project coordinated devastation upward into the sacred center of surface post-war elfdom. Consider what that means strategically. The surface had not solved the deep. It had not even adequately bounded it. A rare alliance of drow and duergar swarmed into Elven Court and then on towards Saarfill. The battle at the feast began evenly only because surprise has a first breath and then must prove itself. But when the second wave came, when more dark elves and grey dwarves surged from below, the elves and dwarves were overwhelmed. The invaders brought new malignant magics learned in exile. They conjured spiders, deepspawn, and worse into the city. They cloaked the court in inky darkness by day. They collapsed, desecrated, and corrupted temples. The very place where weapons had never been drawn at the center now rang with desperate fighting. One can hear the symbolic cruelty in every detail. The city of lore ruined in days, the gods' houses profaned, neutral ground made killing ground, peace itself in a sense mocked. More than 30 clans of elves and dwarves lost leaders there. Saarfill fell. Its people fought holding actions in the tunnels, and King Daringo the Doomed pursued the invaders back toward his homeland, only to find greater horror waiting. Within a month, he and his dwindled retinue fled north, abandoning Saarfill to occupation and partition by the dark powers below. Elven Court, though not permanently held by the invaders, was despoiled so thoroughly that it ceased thereafter to function as it once had. The old holy center was abandoned. Later, Cormantha would inherit its memory and its political role in altered form. But the original place became a haunted, ruined warning. That is one of the founding time's bleakest lessons. Even the places built specifically to prevent a return of old catastrophe can be undone by consequences the survivors preferred to imagine as elsewhere. Shevarash's vow belongs here as well. One of the few survivors of the slaughter, he swore never to laugh or smile until Lolth and her drow were destroyed. A god of hatred was born from aftermath. Remember that when later elven drow enmity sounds to you like mere ancient prejudice. Much of it is that, yes, but it is also historically fed by moments like this. Moments when the deep reached up and proved that post-war holiness had not made the surface safe, only complacent in more dignified attire. I do not say the drow were unified after this. They were not. The same centuries that see them able to cooperate for a single devastating assault also see them splitting, warring, migrating, and founding rival powers. But this too is part of mature geopolitics. One need not love one's subterranean cousins to join them for a raid worth the trouble. The duergar and drow understood convenience very well indeed. Surface peoples, forever prattling about whether an alliance is morally coherent, might learn something from how efficiently their enemies have historically behaved. After the Dark Court slaughter, the Deep continues northward. In -3917, Menzoberra the Kinless led 7 drow families out of southern holdings, such as Golothair, into the North Dark, seeking escape from incessant wars between Lolthites and Garnadar's worshippers. Lolth aided them, according to the city's own traditions, and the cavern they claimed became Menzoberranzan. Mark the significance. By this stage, the Drow are not merely holding old exilic cities, they are generating new centers far from the earliest zones of descent. Menzoberranzan, later so infamous that surface taverns use its name as shorthand for everything they fear below, begins as a migration born from intra-Drow conflict. Not from surface pressure, not from elven armies forcing relocation, from Drow politics itself. The Deep has become self-propelling. Only a few decades later, in -3843, House Nasadra and allied exiles from Menzoberranzan founded Ched Nasad, after house conflict in the older city nearly tore it apart. Again, the founding time produces branching genealogies below every bit as much as above. One city breeds another. One priestess war becomes a migration. One doctrinal fight becomes a new cavern state. If the elves on the surface are becoming a constellation of refugees and counterweights, the Drow below are becoming a constellation of spider cities, rival cult centers, and hungry trade powers. This is why the Deep matters so much to the Age. It is not simply a basement into which the surface has shoved its moral leftovers. It is a second political world growing beneath the first, influenced by surface decisions but not controlled by them. And unlike the surface, it is hemmed in by stone in such a way that every gain feels more absolute and every loss more final. This breeds intensity. It also breeds memory with knives in it. Do not imagine either that the Drow and Duergar were the only old intelligences below. The Illithids of places like Orindol did not become irrelevant because newer exiles grew numerous. Aboleths did not evacuate their drowned reaches out of courtesy. Beholders, cloakers, deep-spawn and nameless older predators continued treating the ambitions of dwarves and drow as weather patterns to exploit. One reason the Underdark is so unforgiving is that its younger states must form amid older hungers. A surface kingdom can at least assume the wolves are not running universities of predation 2 valleys over. The Deep offers no such comfort. You may be building a city beside a creature older than your language that regards your tax system as an amusing food delivery experiment. This pressures policy in ways surface thinkers seldom grasp. Drow cruelty is not excused by environment, but it is sharpened by it. Dwarven caution below is not mere temperament. It is a rational answer to layered threat. Duergar hardness is not wholly theological. In the Deep, softness becomes a public utility for one's enemies. So when we ask who inherits ruins, the answer underground is especially unstable. The dwarves inherit Perindan, then lose it. The Drow inherit those losses, then lose Talantiwa to collapse. Gold dwarves return to inherit the rift. Drow houses scatter and inherit neighboring caverns. Lurth Dryer fights itself over which god inherits its future. Shamath opens a western chapter. Menzoberranzan and Ched Nasad push the Drow story north. Elven Court, on the surface, discovers too late that its own ruin has been inherited temporarily by the forces that made it. This is inheritance without permanence, succession without closure. In other words, a truer history than most legal traditions ever manage. There is another way to read the founding time, one many annals neglect because tariffs are less glamorous than coronals and less immediately terrifying than demon-blooded nobles. Read it through trade. Ruins are not only military opportunities or religious embarrassments, they are economic facts. A broken kingdom leaves behind routes, clearings, half-maintained bridges, forgotten ferries, abandoned cisterns, empty harbours, old caravan habits, and very often populations nearby who still remember where the market used to be. The first peoples to use these remnants intelligently do not always become the most beloved in later songs, but they very often become the next powers. In the forests, elven trade had to learn humility. The post-war and post-descent realms could no longer assume that beauty itself would draw all value in the proper direction. A hidden valley such as Everesca traded carefully and selectively because secrecy was one of its primary assets. Elven court, by contrast, leveraged sanctity and trust, becoming a meeting ground and later a pilgrimage site. Arkora's successor realms traded memory, craft, and magical insight as much as raw goods. The point is not merely that elves exchanged things. The point is that each polity's way of surviving shaped what it was willing to circulate. A realm founded on concealment will not move information as freely as one founded on central adjudication. A realm traumatized by dynastic excess will watch luxury traffic differently from a realm still half in love with aristocratic grandeur. This had consequences. Trade became one of the great teachers of political temperament. Merchants learn quickly which roads are safe, which wardens are rigid, which tolls hide policy beneath bookkeeping, which priesthoods ask too many charmingly unanswerable questions. By the middle of the founding time, caravans and river traffic are not just moving wealth. They are carrying reputations between peoples who no longer share one obvious civilizational center. Dwarves excel in such an age because their memory is logistical. They remember not just who offended whom, but which underpass floods in Second Thaw, which old way station can be repaired, which clan once maintained the pumps under that shaft before the Duergar took it, which southern city will accept ingots at honest weight, and which will smile while cheating you by a thumb's breadth. To inherit ruins economically is to know which fragments can be made reliable again. This the dwarves know almost obscenely well. The drow, for their part, weaponize trade with a colder intimacy. In the deep, commerce and coercion are difficult to separate because every road is a choke point and every market depends on armed permission. Slave-taking, fungus cultivation, venom, rare ores, underways to otherwise unreachable regions, and the movement of information about surfaces none of the buyers have ever seen. These all become currencies. A drow city able to secure passage through 3 caverns and 1 fungal basin may exert leverage across distances a surface duke would not even recognize as contiguous territory. This is why underground politics become so dangerous to the surface, even before surface rulers understand them. The deep is building supply systems beneath their assumptions. And humans, once more, learn fastest from what they do not feel obliged to mourn. A human trader moving along an older elven route does not ordinarily care whether the road was once ceremonial, sacred, or reserved for diplomats of three mutually suspicious elder realms whose language possessed 13 noun forms for moonlight on formal occasions. He cares whether the paving still drains, whether the ford ahead has shifted, whether goblins have started using the south bank, whether an abandoned watchtower can be occupied cheaply, and whether the elves in the next forest will allow passage in exchange for ironwork or expect songs and genealogy. This practicality makes human commerce adaptive. It also makes it invasive. What the elder peoples had once invested with meaning, humans often turned into movement. There is no insult in that observation. Or rather there is, but history does not mind. One can watch the ages' balance shift through exactly such mundane transformations. A route no longer patrolled by a vanished elven realm becomes first a smuggler's path, then a seasonal caravan road, then a defended trade line, then a border claim, and finally, after a few generations of stubborn children and buried dead, a homeland in the imagination of people whose ancestors first arrived there because the paving still looked serviceable. This is how ruins stop belonging to memory and start belonging to habit. And habit, more than law, is what makes later maps feel inevitable. The same applies to religion, incidentally. Shrines abandoned by one people are sometimes shunned by the next. More often they are reinterpreted, looted for stone, rededicated, or allowed to linger as useful dread on the edge of a field. A place once hallowed to the Seldarine may become, for humans camped nearby, a cautionary landmark, and then a local taboo, and then a festival ground, after someone decides the old spirits appreciate ale well enough. A dwarven way altar deep below may be defaced by Duergar, reconsecrated by returnees, and later treated by surface smugglers as a dependable rendezvous because the Grey Ones don't go there on third-day turns. This is not irreverence so much as historical metabolism. The founding time metabolized everything. That is why it fascinates me more than cleaner eras of straightforward ascent. It is an age of conversion. Grief into policy, roads into borders, caverns into states, shrines into warnings, warnings into songs, songs into identity, identity into appetite. And appetite, once organized, is what inheritance looks like from the outside. If the Drow teach the founding time that exile can harden into ambition, the Dwarves teach something else. That loss can become continuity without ever pretending it was fair. I shall not spend the whole next episode's labor in advance. A law warden who empties every shelf at once is merely untidy. But the dwarves belong centrally to tonight's question because they are among the greatest inheritors of ruined ages anywhere in Faerûn. Not because they always inherit cleanly. They do not. Not because they are always victorious. They are not. But because they possess the rare cultural stubbornness required to return to broken places and still treat them as obligations rather than embarrassments. We have already seen this in the Deep Realm, founded around the Great Rift after Telantiwar's collapse. The Gold Dwarves did not come back to a preserved ancestral kingdom. They came back to a place violated first by conquest and then by geologic catastrophe. Yet they returned. They named, they delved, they held. They became a people in part because they refused to let a wound have the last architectural word. The shield dwarves tell a related story in the north. Centuries before the Great Rift's formation, westward and northward, migrations out of the older southern dwarf realms had already seeded new dwarven destinies. By the later founding time, these lineages and their successor polities would help anchor northern strength. The founding of Delzoun in -3900 is one of the clearest signs that the age of mere survival is ending for at least some dwarven peoples. A realm under stone can once again aspire to breadth, not empire in the flamboyant elven sense perhaps. Dwarves are less likely to write poetry about their own cheekbones while founding a nation. But breadth, yes. Roads, delvings, forges, military lines, defensive theory, trade. This matters because it shows the founding time does not belong exclusively to the races that lost most visibly in the Crown Wars. It belongs also to those who found in the vacuum room enough to consolidate. The South offers another revealing case. Long before humans become great empire builders in their own right, the dwarves of Xanatar are already acting as kingmakers of a sort, or at least as the stern, practical partners without whom certain human recoveries would have gone rather worse. When the elemental genie empires of Kalim and Memnon collapsed after their own catastrophic age of skyfire and struggle, the lands around them did not simply heal. Someone had to drive out the lingering remnants, retake cities, and make new political sense of ruins, half shaped by genies and half by terrified humans trying not to die under them. By -6060, with dwarven aid from Xanatar, Kalishite humans had cast out the last vestiges of genie rule, rebuilt Kalimport and Keltar, and founded Khorramshan. I bring this up now not to trespass fully into the later episode on the human empires, but because it is a nearly perfect founding time event. The ruins of a non-human magical tyranny are inherited by humans, yes, but not alone. Dwarves are there in the bones of the solution. Stonecraft, warcraft, engineering, and the older memory of how to reduce a thing to practical terms all contribute. Who inherits ruins? Often not one race, but an alliance of survivors with different talents and very unequal dreams. Khorramshan later changes, broadens, joins with Mir, and becomes Kalimshan around -5005. But the founding impulse is what concerns us tonight. A human realm rises not in untouched land, but atop wrecked sorcery and emptied palaces. That is the founding time, in one image. Younger peoples making statecraft from someone else's magical disaster. Dwarves appear at the edges of many such stories. They hold trade lines others need. They shape mountain passes. They decide whether the old, deep roads are still usable or suicidally interesting. They anchor local economies with craft that does not require every generation to rediscover metallurgy as if it were a personal insight. They also carry grudges with a seriousness that makes them reliable in strange ways. A dwarf realm may not forgive, but it will usually remember its terms. In an age when many elf polities were still learning that beauty is not a substitute for constitutional caution, this counted for a great deal. There is, however, a harder side to dwarven inheritance. Returning to ruins does not mean becoming generous. The dwarves of the founding time were capable of narrowness, ferocity, interclan fracture, and long strategic blindness of their own. The Durgar exist after all, and the split between grey dwarves and other dwarven kindreds is part of this same age's broader subterranean hardening. We will deal with that sorrow properly next time. For now, it is enough to say that the dwarves did not escape the realm's common law. Every people answers catastrophe by preserving some virtues and intensifying some vices. Still, by the later founding time, the dwarves are plainly one of Faerûn's most capable inheritors of the post-elven order. They will matter immensely to what comes next, not only below, but in relation to the fast-rising humans. And the humans, at last, must enter properly. Short-lived peoples inherit ruins differently. They have less time for reverence. This is not always a flaw. Reverence can become paralysis. A human village settling beside the fallen marker stones of an elder road does not spend 6 generations debating whether the old meaning has been sufficiently honored before sending wagons down it. It sends wagons. It asks which bridge still holds. It steals the cutstone if necessary. It learns the local ghost stories mainly in order to price risk. If the site is useful, it becomes part of the settlement. If dangerous, it becomes a boundary legend. If profitable, it becomes a market. Humans, lacking the burden and privilege of very long memory, often metabolize inherited ruin into use faster than elder peoples can bear to watch. This is one reason they come to dominate so much of later Faerûn. Not because they are wiser, because they are quicker to practicalize the dead. The founding time is when that quickness begins to matter at scale. In the east, around -7975, the artificer lord Umyatin founded Inupras, and with it the early Imaskari Empire. There is a temptation to treat Imaskar as an entirely separate story, an Eastern anomaly, a proto-techno-magical marvel, a prelude to later hubris. All true, and a whole episode awaits it. But even here, the logic of the founding time holds. Imaskar rises in a world where the elder races are fragmented and where large human polities are beginning to discover that one need not merely squat in old ruins. One can manufacture new forms of greatness. Portal networks, artificer rule, planned expansion. These are not the habits of scavengers. They are the habits of a people who no longer assume the elder races will remain permanently above them in every domain that matters. In the south, as we have just seen, Khorramshan emerges from the ruins of Genie War with dwarven support and later broadens into Kalimshan. Here, humans inherit very literal palaces of old magical empire and decide, with astonishing nerve, to make them administrative. The marble once belonged to beings of elemental vastness. Now it houses kings and bureaucrats with mortal lifespans and perfectly ordinary appetites. One can either call that audacity or history. I recommend both. Around -5800, Jam united human tribes north of the elven realm of Nikarimath and founded Jamdath, the psionic empire that would one day trouble both neighbors and posterity in fascinating ways. Again, the pattern. Humans are no longer peripheral. They are organizing, theorizing power, founding cities, and beginning to rival the old races on terms the old races did not invent. The elves, still rebuilding in forests and hidden vales, now find themselves living beside younger states that are not content merely to marvel at elven ruins or trade politely along their edges. And in the north, perhaps most poignantly of all, the 7 fishing villages on the narrow sea united in -3859 to form the Alliance of Seventon, setting year 0 of the Netheril calendar. Later ages remember Netheril for floating cities, Mythalars, impossible magic, and Karsus's terminal idiocy. Fair enough. But I cherish the humble beginning. 7 villages banding together for mutual protection while the bones of older ages lay all around the wider north. There is something profoundly founding time about that. Humans begin not with sky cities but with fear, cooperation, fishing nets, and a very practical desire not to be eaten by the things that roam a world older than they are. That is how great human ages start in Faerûn. Not from innocence, from exposure. The humans of the founding time live among leftovers, old roads, old wards, old songs misremembered, ruined keeps, empty watchlines, scattered elven settlements that still look impossibly graceful. Dwarven traders whose grandfathers' grandfathers remember caves the humans have never heard named. Monsters pushed outward by deeper changes no one on the surface fully understands. Their genius is not that they understand all this quickly. They do not. Their genius is that they keep building anyway. This unsettles the elder peoples. It should. A long-lived race can mistake caution for ownership. We still remember this place properly, they think. Therefore, it is ours in some deeper sense. Humans introduce a rude counter-argument. You may remember it. We are using it. That tension will shape the next several ages of Faerûn more than any elf comfortably admits. Yet, let me be fair, the humans were not merely opportunists in the sneering sense. They were also inheritors by necessity. Vacant riverlands invite farms because children must eat. Broken fortifications invite reuse because wood and stone are labor. Border territories abandoned by elder races do not remain poetic for long when young mortal communities are being pressed by orcs, goblinkin, predators, winter, and the simple arithmetic of survival. One can criticize human expansion without pretending it arose from cartoon villainy. It arose because the elder races left gaps, and because the younger races, being numerous and vulnerably alive, moved into them. History rarely needs worse motives than hunger plus opportunity. Remember that the next time someone explains 1,000 years of settlement with a speech about destiny. By the close of the founding time then, the board has changed utterly. The elves still possess wonders and strongholds enough to humble any simple account of decline. The dwarves still hold and refound their own deep, stubborn kingdoms. The drow and other underdark powers have become fully political actors rather than mere shadows of a surface sentence. And humans have moved from villages and tribes into the first serious architectures of later age-making empire. The age of solely elven consequences is over. The age of everybody else living with them has begun. Why then do chronologers usually end the founding time around -3000? Because by then the old answer, the realms, is still chiefly a story about how the elder peoples are settling their own aftermath, has ceased to suffice. The younger powers are no longer incidental. You can feel this long before the formal boundary. Imaskar in the east is already imperial. Khorramshan and then Kalimshan have shown that humans can seize the debris of non-human magical catastrophe and make durable statehood from it. Jamdath has proven that human polities need not imitate elven or dwarven models to become formidable. Psionics, not high magic, can underwrite a civilization just as ambitious and in some respects even more unnerving. Netherill's earliest communal arrangements hint at a northern people who will not remain content with fishing villages and mutual defense once the right knowledge appears. Even where the great human empires are not yet supreme, they are imaginable. That is the pivot. An age ends not only when old things die, but when new things become thinkable at scale. For thousands of years, even amid internecine elven madness, Faerûn's greatest question had still been some variation of what are the elder races doing to the world and to each other? During the founding time, that question changes into what kind of world have the elder races left available for everyone else? Once that shift occurs, the board is altered permanently. Humans do not need to defeat every elven realm in battle to change history. They only need enough room, enough need, enough roots, and enough audacity to become unavoidable. The elder peoples sensed this, though not always in words. One can hear it in elven reserve toward human settlement near old forests. One can hear it in dwarven negotiations that begin to treat human communities as long-term commercial facts rather than seasonal nuisances. One can hear it in the way surface rulers grow more alert to raids, tunnels, and strange market goods, moving up from below at precisely the moment human populations along those routes are thickening. Density changes everything. A sparse frontier can absorb marvel and horror as rumor. A settled frontier must make policy. That is what the close of the founding time produces. Policy-minded neighbors. This is also why the era should never be told merely as a sequence of foundings. It is a sequence of adjustments in what counts as normal. A hidden elf realm is normal now. A dwarven reclamation atop older ruin is normal now. A drow city with its own internal factions, its own trade leverage, and its own reasons for war entirely independent of surface affairs is normal now. A human state built on the bones of someone else's grandeur is normal now. An old holy city left haunted because no one can quite afford or stomach its restoration is normal now. Once these become normal, later Faerûn becomes possible. And daily life keeps teaching the lesson more effectively than thrones do. By the later founding time, a merchant's daughter in a growing human town may know an elf only as the distant, unnervingly elegant representative of a hidden wood to whom her father must pay special tolls in good iron and utter honesty. A young dwarf in Delzoun may think of elves not first as legendary first-comers, but as useful allies to the south, and intermittently exasperating forest powers whose roads matter less than the orc-haunted passes ahead. A drow novice in one of the northern cities may know the surface as rumor, target, ancestral insult, theological symbol, and potential source of slaves, but not as home. A moon elf child in Everesca may grow up hearing of humans as noisy, brief, multiplying things in the outer lands, whose curiosity must be watched, and whose friendships, if chosen, must be chosen very carefully indeed. These are not minor perceptual differences. They are the beginnings of the later realms. A world in which every people imagines the others through layered aftermath is a world ripe for faction, misunderstanding, alliance, and adventure in the broadest sense. By contrast, The earlier ages of simple elder race predominance, if such ages ever truly existed outside their own songs, leave less room for later complexity. The founding time manufactures complexity because no one is central enough anymore to define the world alone. Not even the elves. Especially not the elves. That is part of what makes Cormantha's rise, which we have just touched, so remarkable. It is a mainland elven unification achieved in a world already escaping full elven custody. One might almost call it a final great attempt to prove that elder beauty, oath, and high magic can still answer plurality without defaulting either to empire or to seclusion. Whether it fully succeeded is another matter, and one the later episodes will happily torment. But even beyond Cormantha, the logic stands. The end of the founding time is not the disappearance of the elder peoples. It is the disappearance of their monopoly on significance. You will forgive me if I linger over that phrase, because it describes so much more than maps. A monopoly on significance means the default assumption that one's wars are the wars, one's ruins the important ruins, one's gods the most historically consequential gods, one's languages the proper medium of memory, one's losses the measure of tragedy. The elves had lived with such a monopoly, or near enough, for a very long while. The founding time erodes it. Dwarves preserve strong alternative civilizational continuities. Drow create a second political world below. Humans begin producing states too large, too clever, or too hungry to dismiss as temporary weather. This should make you suspicious whenever a later elf speaks of the fading, as though it were purely something done to them by crude younger races. Encroachment is real, human expansion is real, decline is real. But much of what later ages call fading began as pluralization. The world became too full of other consequential peoples for the Telquesir to remain the uncontested main argument of Faerûn. That is a loss, yes. It is also merely what happens when history stops flattering you. And now, with that pleasant wound opened, we may close the age. Yet before we leave the elves to the margins entirely, we must note one final and magnificent refusal. Cormantha. Too many later summaries treat the founding time as though the elves simply dwindled into prettier corners, while humans and dwarves became the active history. This is false. The elves were diminished in breadth, yes. They were fragmented in answer, yes. But they were not finished. In the eastern forest, the realms seeded around Elven Court endured, grew, grieved, fought, traded, and learned. For nearly 5 millennia after the first settlers moved out from the court into Arkarar, the forest remained a place where elven possibility gathered, rather than merely hid. Then came more sorrow. The 12 nights of fire devastated Uveren when a falling star and widespread meteor shower set the western woods ablaze for 12 days, shattering one of the great lore realms of early Arkarar and sending its survivors into neighboring domains. A few centuries after that came the return of the dark, the very assault upon Elven Court and Sarfil of which we have spoken. The old holy city was ruined. The eastern forest learned painfully that even carefully built peace can be pierced from below. And still the elves there did not vanish. This matters. It would have been reasonable after Uveren's loss and Elven Court's desecration for Arkarar's peoples to retreat permanently into smaller enclaves and call any dream of renewed unity a dangerous indulgence. Instead, they carried on long enough and with sufficient discipline that in -3983 coronal Cavourm Irithil united Semberholm, Elven Court's surviving authority, Gyron Star, and the other eastern domains into Cormanthir, founding the city of Cormanthor by the summoning of the Rule Tower. I will be plain. This is one of the great acts of restorative statecraft in all Faerûnian history. Not because it undid the Crown Wars, nothing could. Not because it re-established the old continental primacy of the Telkesir. It did not. But because it proved that post-traumatic civilization need not remain only enclave, shrine, and evasive brilliance. It could still dare a center, a chastened one, a more constitutionally burdened one, a center carrying the memory of Elven Court and the cost of Uverin and the warning of old Arivandar, but a center nonetheless. Cormanthir, in that sense, is the highest mainland Elven answer the founding time produces. Its capital, later called Myth Dranor, would eventually become one of the most audacious civic experiments the realms ever saw. We will earn that story in a later episode. For now, it is enough to understand what Cormanthir's founding means at the close of our present age. The elves do not choose only concealment. They do not yield wholly to the younger peoples. They do not conclude, finally, that the proper answer to old fire is permanent shrinking. They try once more. That attempt is not naive. It is built after too much has already been learned. It rises in a world where the old Elven Court is already a ruin, where drow cities are multiplying beneath far reaches of Faerûn, where dwarven powers hold the underways and mountains with renewed confidence, where humans have begun founding their own great realms, and where the high forest itself has already shown how easily old supremacist dreams can return wearing cleaner robes. In other words, Cormanthir is born not into a world of elven assumption, but into a competitive, haunted, increasingly plural Faerûn. That is why it fascinates me so. The Great Eastern answer is not an inheritance of innocence, it is an inheritance of warning. And this, perhaps, is the founding time's most important distinction from the first flowering. The earlier age built as though greatness were natural. This one builds as though greatness must be supervised. One sees the difference everywhere. In the moonblades forged earlier as tests against unworthy blood. In the continued prestige of holy and deliberative authority after ordinary monarchy had been compromised. In the persistence of hidden havens even alongside larger new realms. In the care with which later elven projects frame themselves not merely as beautiful, but as justified. Even when the elves build boldly again, they build as a people who remember what their own magnificence once cost. Not all of them remember equally, of course. History is under no obligation to grant such symmetry, but the age remembers through institutions even when individuals grow sentimental. Now step back with me. From -9,000 to -3,000 Della Reckoning, the map of Faerûn becomes recognizably the map from which later adventure, empire, faction, and catastrophe will grow. Not identical. Gods preserve us from that sort of tidy prefiguration, but recognizably related. The old crown war world is gone. In its place stand Evermeet offshore and shining with all the ambiguity of refuge. Evereska, hidden and watchful in the west. Sharvan, Silvanede, Eorlan, and their bitter northern lessons about how quickly old pride can breed new war. Arkara ripened into Cormanther after ages of caution, loss, and persistence. The green and wild elves settled more fully into woods and local sacred geographies that would shape their later peoples. The Great Rift and the Deep Realm bore witness to dwarven return. Delzoun rose in the north. Sarfil fell, and with it a model of eastern coexistence. Talantiwar broke. Lurth-Dryer fought within itself. Shamath appeared. Menzoberranzan and Ched-Nasad marked the northward flowering of Drow power. Immerskar, Corumshan, Jamdath, and the First Netherese alliance signaled that humans had ceased to be merely a fact of the margins. When a later adventurer walks Faerûn and finds old roads, buried halls, taboo ruins, mountain citadels, invisible valleys, haunted elf woods, black subterranean trade routes, and human polities rising cheek by jowl with elder wreckage, this is the age that made the landscape legible, not by peace, by accumulated refounding. You see now, I hope, why I said at the beginning that founding is a flattering verb. It invites the lazy mind to imagine clean beginnings. The founding time offers no such thing. Every important beginning of this era is double-faced. Evereska is haven and confession. Silvanede is restoration and relapse. Eorlan is defense and strategic preemption. Talantiwar is survival and conquest. The Great Rift is catastrophe and return. The Dark Court slaughter is atrocity and revelation. Menzoberranzan is escape and the birth of a terror. Corumshan is liberation and appropriation. Jamdath is unification and the start of a future imperial pressure. Netheril begins as mutual aid and will become eventually the grandest cautionary tale in the history of arcane infrastructure. Cormanther is renewal and burden. This doubleness is not a flaw in the record. It is the record. Civilizations seldom get to begin again with empty hands. They begin with old tools, old sins, old names, old stones, old hunger, old gods, old roads, and new children who must be taught which part of the inheritance is treasure and which is simply momentum dressed as destiny. That, more than any date, is the founding time. An age when everyone is living among somebody else's aftermath. An age when the surface ceases to be an exclusively elven question. An age when the deep stops being consequence and becomes history of its own. An age when the younger peoples learn that the elder world's ruins can be studied, reused, bypassed, or surpassed. An age when the elder peoples discover that survival is possible, but never again simple. And perhaps above all, an age when Faerûn learns the difference between restoration and replacement. It does not restore what was lost. It grows around it. So, what is the verdict on the founding time? Not peace, not recovery, not a golden rebuilding after a regrettable civil war. The verdict is harsher and more useful. The founding time is the age in which Faerûn learns to live amid unresolved inheritance. That is why I wish to ask all evening who inherits ruins, because the answer is never singular. The elves inherit their own shame and answer it with courts, hidden vales, island sanctuaries, guarded forests, tested heirlooms, and at last one renewed Eastern Empire. The dwarves inherit broken depths and answer with reclamation, stubborn architecture, alliance, and a refusal to let defeat have sole custody of memory. The drow inherit exile and answer with conquest, faction, priestly ambition, urban cruelty, migration, and the production of a whole subterranean history the surface ignores at its peril. Humans inherit vacancy and answer with use, speed, adaptation, and eventually empire. The deep inherits surface complacency. The surface inherits the deep's maturity by surprise. Everyone receives something damaged. No one receives only what they deserve. That is history of the sort worth keeping. This is also, I think, the first era in our series where Faerûn begins to feel fully dangerous in the later adventuring sense. Not because monsters suddenly appeared. There have always been monsters, and some of them were civilly dressed, but because the world's layers are now active at once. Above ground and below ground histories are interacting. Old sacred centers can be ruined by consequences rising from beneath them. Human villages can sit within reach of older elf woods and still become the seeds of major powers. Dwarven roads below can alter surface trade centuries before surface rulers understand why their markets have changed. A hidden valley can remain politically central by virtue of what it refuses to reveal. A drow city can be founded because of a civil war in another drow city that itself exists because of an earlier collapse of a conquered dwarven realm under a cursed elven people. This, my apprentice, is when Faerûn becomes not just old, but recursive. Everything starts having a beneath and a before. That is what later ages inherit most of all. If the Crown Wars were the shattering of elder certainty, the founding time is the long and uneven schooling by which the world learns how to function after certainty dies. Some responses are noble, some are predatory, some are both. Elven Court and Evereska preserve memory and safety, but they also normalize guardedness. Silvanede preserves high beauty and discipline while demonstrating with almost insulting clarity that refinement without humility remains an accelerant. The Great Rift becomes both dwarf rebirth and proof that conquered realms can break their conquerors by means neither side truly masters. The Dark Court slaughter exposes the deep as a strategic actor. Imaskar, Koramshan, Jamdath, and Netherill's first alliance reveal that humans are no longer merely inheriting the world. They are beginning to author it. And that is why the age ends where it does. By -3000 reckoning, the question is no longer simply how the elder races will repair their own broken house. The question is what all the peoples of Faerûn will do in a world where the house has many claimants, several basements, and at least one staircase built directly over a sinkhole. You may notice that I sound less mournful tonight than last time. Do not mistake that for cheer. I am less mournful because this age, for all its tragedies, is alive with consequence. The dead are no longer merely accusing the living. They are being used by them. Roads are taken up, valleys are hidden, caverns are claimed, crowns are tested, capitals are raised. Cities below the world begin to make independent trouble. Younger peoples stop waiting for permission to matter. There is grief in this, yes. There is also vigor, and the archive is obliged to admit vigor even when it belongs to people one's own civilization would once have dismissed as annoyingly brief. Next time, we go more fully under stone. The outline of dwarven history has already crossed tonight's shelves, often enough to make the iron clasps twitch. In the next episode, we will follow the dwarven ages more directly, the kingdoms under mountain and beneath earth, the clan compacts that outlast kings, the stern logic of holds and highways, the fractures that produce cousins turned strangers, and the wars below that shape the surface more than most surface courts ever understand. If tonight asked who inherits ruins, next time asks who can swear to them hard enough to keep them. There will be oaths, there will be stone, there will be engineering so stubborn it begins to resemble theology. Before the folio closes, I leave you, as always, with questions worth carrying upward into the noise. When a civilization chooses secrecy, as Everesca did, is that wisdom, grief, or a slow surrender of any claim to the open world? When a people returns to ruined ancestral ground, as the dwarves did in the Great Rift, what exactly have they regained? Homeland, duty, or merely the right to suffer in an older shape? Is Silvanede best understood as a failed restoration of Arivandar, or as proof that catastrophe alone does not cure the appetites that caused it? What troubles you more, that the drow became full powers beneath the world, or that the surface took so long to understand that exile had turned into politics? And when humans begin to build among these elder remains, do you hear opportunism first, or do you hear the ordinary, practical courage of short-lived people who cannot afford to wait for old races to finish grieving before they plant fields and raise walls? Sit with those. History does not improve when we answer too quickly. If these words find you by crystal, parchment, whisper, borrowed sending, respectable pamphlet, or some gleaming device whose maker imagines novelty abolished mortality, leave your reflections where others may read them. Tell me which founding time answer you trust most. The hidden valley, the holy court, the reclaimed delve, the mixed frontier realm, the practical human town, or the brutal efficiency of the deep. Tell me whether the creation of Cormanther strikes you as the highest achievement of post-Crown War elfdom, or its last grand refusal to admit the world had already become plural beyond their preference. Tell me whether you think ruins are ever really inherited by the most worthy, or only by the most adaptive. And tell me, perhaps most importantly, what you think the realms gains when no single people can claim a monopoly on significance. The older I become, and undeath, I assure you, is not without its distortions, the more I suspect plurality is one of history's crueler mercies. It prevents innocence. It also prevents the tidy lies innocence prefers. Now the candles burn shorter. The dust has settled a little farther down the shelves. The old stone keeps its counsel, though I assure you it disapproves of nearly everyone equally, which is more fairness than most senates manage. Before you climb back toward Waterdeep and its bright, expensive forgetfulness, remember that the archive has a door now. taleofthelich.com is live. The timelines are gathering there, the transcripts are growing there, and the connective threads between these ages are being laid down with the care such dangerous memory deserves. If tonight has left you wanting the map beneath the map, go to taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon as well because apparently the burden of civilizational memory now arrives in wearable form. I remain skeptical, but not entirely opposed to a future in which someone buys a shirt and accidentally learns about the Great Rift. Stranger paths to wisdom have existed. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need a site built with taste, a system built with foresight, or digital infrastructure designed by people who understand that collapse is not an acceptable development methodology, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If the tale served you tonight, leave a rating or review. Modern remembrance is sorted by shallow machines that confuse popularity with value and novelty with significance. Each small gesture helps keep older truths from being paved over by louder nonsense. Until next time, my apprentice, close the archive gently, mind the stare, do not mistake a quiet ruin for an empty one. And remember, the world after a great war does not belong to the victors. It belongs to the survivors, the scavengers, the builders, the faithful, the tunnelers, the opportunists, the oath keepers, and the children who learn the old roads by use instead of by right. Good night. May your memory prove longer than your vanity, your foundations sounder than your slogans, and your judgment wary of any history that claims rebuilding ever begins on clean ground.